Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. And thanks for joining us today, where I'll be talking about Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventories in more detail, and specifically talking about our Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventories for purchased goods and services credible. So I'm first going to start just by reviewing what are Scope 3 purchased goods and services, just to make sure that everybody is on the same page and clear on what this category of greenhouse gas emissions are from a corporate greenhouse gas emissions perspective. So Scope 3 broadly includes 15 different categories of emissions. This is a figure from the WRI Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which shows the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 categories graphically. So as you'll recall, Scope 1 includes direct emissions at company facilities and from fuel used in company-owned vehicles. Scope 2, indirect, includes emissions associated with generating energy, either from purchased electricity or steam or other types of heat energy. Scope 3 includes 15 different categories, including not only purchased goods and services, but also things like capital goods, fuel and energy-related activities, and so on. I won't be talking about the other 14 categories in much depth today. Today I'll be focusing on this one on the left-hand side here, purchased goods and services. Now, all of the Scope 3 categories do fit into two types of buckets, if you will. There's either the upstream activities, which includes everything purchased by your company, and then downstream activities, which includes everything sold and other types of categories. And purchased goods and services clearly fits unambiguously into the upstream activity categorization. Now, an overview of the key steps in a Scope 3 assessment. The first step is to define your boundaries, which categories and which facilities you'd like to include. The second step is to collect the data. And the third step is to calculate your carbon footprints. I'm going to pause for just a second. Holly let me know that there's an issue with my screen appearance. So I apologize for that. I think you guys have not been able to see the far right-hand side. So thanks for your patience on that. So yes, these are the key steps in the Scope 3 assessments. Now, that was just at the highest level about Scope 3 for all categories. I'll now talk at a very high level about collecting data from the different Scope 3 categories and then dive in depth into the purchased goods and services category. And then I'll talk about the different data types and credibility issues that you may find with them. So when you look at things such as employee commuting, this data can be collected through employee surveys or even rough estimates based on national average employee commute distance. Things like franchise and leased assets, these can go out through data requests about energy use. Purchased goods and services, this requires I would say much more sophisticated data collection and analysis steps than any of the other Scope 3 categories. And so this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time today and then talk about some of the pitfalls with existing data to ensure that any Scope 3 inventory that you do evaluate is going to be credible and useful to you. So a few key steps in the purchased goods and services greenhouse gas assessments. This is the approach that we use at SCS when we're doing this type of analysis. The first is that to map out your supply chain and spend and identify the probable greenhouse gas hotspots. So you can do a tremendous amount before you even have any greenhouse gas data simply by looking at what are your key suppliers in category areas of spend. Once you've done that, you can identify the data sources which will be used, ensuring that they're going to be accurate and credible for the purpose you're trying to achieve. Then you can actually collect the data once you've sort of done the planning step. Revisit as needed to fill in data gaps, and finally compile data and calculate results. So the final step, compiling and calculating, is not as difficult as the data collection and integration, as you might well imagine. So just an example, two examples of mapping out supply chains and identifying main categories of spend. The first is for a relatively small company. This is a canned food processor. And so in this process, we collected data on the different facilities owned and operated by the company and that it purchases different types of goods and services from. Then map that out in a supply chain flow diagram like this and identify the major categories, major suppliers to the company. So these were the major suppliers and the likely greenhouse gas hotspots for this small company. Another way to do this is if you instead have pure spend data, so if you're using a Oracle database type system or something like that to track spend throughout your company, then you can use this type of data to quickly identify the major suppliers just by looking at the contribution to overall expenditure. So this is a snapshot from a client we've recently worked with to do their Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventory. So you can see each row here is a specific supplier. I removed the supplier name for confidentiality. But the different columns are total expenditures, contribution to overall expenditure, cumulative contribution, and then the categories, the categorization by economic sector of the supplier. So you can see it's quite easy to sort and identify the major suppliers. You can see the first one is by far the most important at 6% of the overall spend of the company. But with this quick analysis, you can identify what are the major suppliers of purchased goods and services. And usually, depending on the data exports you can get, you can categorize it quite cleanly as well. Once you've done this, you can analyze this in more depth to begin to understand where you should focus your data collection. So what this chart shows is from the data from the entire list of suppliers that from that previous spreadsheet. Along the horizontal, we have the total number of suppliers to this company. So you can see it's over 200 in this case. Then on the vertical, it's the cumulative contribution to the total spend of those suppliers. So for example, if you look at 20, so the primary 20 suppliers are responsible for nearly 40% of the company's total spend. And I show this just to illustrate that while this type of spend data can seem overwhelming, particularly if there's hundreds of suppliers, such as for this company, actually when you start to dig into the meat of it, you really have the 80-20 rule becomes very apparent. So for example here, just the top 40 suppliers accounted for 50% of the company's total spend out of hundreds of suppliers. So clearly those top 40 were the most important for data collection efforts. And not shown on here, but we did a separate analysis on the categories of suppliers. And actually the top 10 supplier categories accounted for almost a third, that's 29% of total spend, and 22% of all the suppliers. So while it might seem overwhelming to think of hundreds of suppliers from around the world, actually when you start to slice and dice things, it simplifies quite a lot because clearly, in this case, what we did was focus on these top 10 supplier categories and those top 40 suppliers to get the best data possible. Now, what is the best data possible? I'm going to talk through some of the data types that you can use in evaluating Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventory and the uncertainty associated with each. So this is a figure that I'm going to walk through on this slide, taken from a WRI technical guidance document on evaluating Scope 3. And essentially we'll talk about for the supplier Scope 1 and 2 emissions and all the other upstream emissions, basically supplying the supplier's Scope 3, if you will. What are the different data types, what's the calculation method, and what are the shortcomings and advantages of each. So the first type of data source is called the supplier-specific method. So this involves collecting supplier-specific data for both the actual supplier itself. So perhaps if you're purchasing a type of component or an ingredient for a food product, say, from a supplier, what are their direct emissions? And then furthermore, what are the direct emissions throughout their supply chain? So that's the first type of data source that WRI speaks to. The second is a hybrid method, which takes the supplier-specific data for the actual supplier operation and then combines it with average process data, so things like national average statistics, lifecycle assessment databases, and the rest. So this is called the hybrid method. The third step down is simply the average data method. So this is using something like a lifecycle assessment database to characterize the entire supplier's emissions. So say if you're purchasing an aluminum component from a supplier, you simply take a data set from a database like EcoInvent and populate that in your greenhouse gas inventory without doing any supplier data collection. And then the furthest down the rung, this is called the spend-based method. So these are emissions based on secondary, what's called EEIO data. I'll speak to that in a couple of slides. But in this slide, I'm just introducing the four tiers of data that you can use to generate Scope 3 results. And a few notes on the accuracy and practicality of each of these. If you look at the supplier-specific method across the entire supplier supply chain even, this is clearly going to be more accurate, but also clearly much more difficult. In fact, I would go on to say that it's probably impractical or even impossible in almost all types of cases to collect specific data not only for your suppliers, but also for your suppliers' suppliers. When you think about just the number of sort of exponentially increasing suppliers involved in that, it really isn't practical to get that for your entire greenhouse gas inventory. Conversely, if you look at the very bottom here, the spend-based method, this is known as less accurate, as I'll talk about in a couple slides. Conversely, it's sort of the easiest to generate. If you have a spend-based information per supplier, you can sort of populate it right in, as we'll see. However, it's much less accurate and has other issues with credibility and practicality and goal setting that I'll speak about. Really the sweet spot, the type of spot that we recommend and always seek to apply in our own greenhouse gas inventories are using either the hybrid method, most preferably, certainly the hybrid method where we have supplier-specific data for the major suppliers wedded with average data for the suppliers, and then average data as needed for the less significant and other missing data pieces. And I'll talk through some more concrete examples of each of these data buckets over the next few slides. Now, having seen about how to split up and analyze the major potential contributors to spend and identify the probable contributors to greenhouse gases, and also the major types of data uncertainty in the different types of data sources, the key step now is to develop a data collection plan to ensure that you're going to minimize the effort entailed in gathering all this data while ensuring the most accuracy. As I said, it's really simply impractical to collect data from all suppliers, let alone suppliers. So you will have to rely on process or even spend data in almost all, well, I would say in all greenhouse gas inventories, you'll have to at least rely on some average data. However, because of the variations in regions, facility types, and et cetera, you really do need some site data, particularly for the key suppliers. So we always strongly recommend trying to interact with some of your key suppliers to collect more specific data, at least for the major buckets of spend where possible. Once you've done this screening, you can then develop what we call a sampling plan tailored to your supply chain, again, focused on the greenhouse gas hotspots. So an example of this exercise that we worked through with a global apparel company. So we first stopped by investigating all of the suppliers for this apparel company. You can see on the left-hand side. That was then categorized into regions and types of suppliers, so fiber mills, spinning mills, fabric mills, garment and finishing mills in these different regions. Once we've done that categorization, we then focused on the major greenhouse gas contributors by spend and supply fraction to identify a small number of mills from which we were going to collect information. In this specific case, we were able to reduce the number of data we needed, or the number of suppliers that we needed to collect data from something like 80 or 100 suppliers in total, just to 5 suppliers, and still be able to have a really strong level of accuracy. So by making sure we very carefully planned out the data collection at the outset, our sort of rule of thumb is that if you plan appropriately, this can help reduce your data collection needs by 80 or 90% while still ensuring a very high level of accuracy. Now, how to collect this supplier-specific data. Again, this is the preferred option, particularly for the suppliers that are the main spend contributors. This involves developing data request forms and sending these data request forms to suppliers. We will usually tailor these based on the specific supplier type so as to make it the most streamlined effort possible. If you're unable to get supplier data, or for those gaps where you simply can't get supplier data for whatever reason, secondary process data is sort of option 2. This is also called average data. So this involves things like life cycle assessment databases. So 2 of the most common ones are EcoInvent, or the U.S. Life Cycle Inventory database developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. There also might be things like environmental product declarations, which could be useful to you based on your specific context. So these are really good resources for filling in the secondary process data. You can also use things like national average economic data to begin to calculate average level process types of spend factors. And I'll walk through an example of this on this slide. So in this specific project, we calculated the average energy use in offices using national economic data. And so I won't walk through the details of this equation, but essentially we were able to calculate the average greenhouse gas emissions from energy consumption per square foot of office using essentially national average statistics on the energy used per square foot of office across the country, and then simple emissions factors for the greenhouse gas emissions per energy use. So for example, we had data from the U.S. Census Bureau on the average electricity use per square foot of office space across the country, and applied that in electricity emissions factor to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions. We also, using that, calculated a spend-based factor based on the dollars of spend per office. I won't go into that in much depth, but I will show the actual outcome here just so you can see some specific results here. So for this specific project, there were 5 service categories that were the most significant supplier categories for this specific client. This included architectural, engineering and related services, legal services, advertising and related services, scientific research and development services, management, scientific, and technical consulting services. So you can see these were fairly straightforward to categorize based on office type, or sorry, by facility type into offices and labs in the scientific research and development. And then using these intensity factors, we calculated the average energy use per $1 million of spend for this company. And you can see this greenhouse gas emissions in terms of metric tons of CO2 equivalent per $1 million ranged from about 6.7 to up to almost 16 for the lab services. So we're able to generate the spend factors using this national economic data, at least for the energy use in this context, which gave us a quite reliable and transparent result in the plain old greenhouse gas inventory. So that was examples and discussion of secondary process data using life cycle assessment databases and national economic data. The third option, and sort of the least favorable option, is what's called economic input-output data, EIO data, sometimes called extended economic input-output data. Sometimes there's an extra E in there, EEIO. Now, I won't go into the details of this, but this essentially has a complex algorithm for calculating these results that takes national economic statistics, has national average greenhouse gas factors for each of these sectors, and has a matrix multiplier across all sectors. So it gives a very holistic, at least in terms of the categories covered, evaluation of greenhouse gases per dollar of spend for each of these economic sector categories. Now, a cautionary note, and this is where the issue of credibility comes up. At SCS, we do a number of life cycle assessment work as well, and so we've evaluated these, what are sometimes called input-output databases, and compare them to specific LCA data and some of our average and LCA database data, much higher quality data. We found that there could be quite a lot of uncertainty in these databases. So for example, this is This table shows for my commonly used LCA database, EIO database, EIO LCA, the kilograms of CO2 equivalents per megawatt hour of emissions for electricity use. We actually did a review looking at the site-specific U.S. Environmental Protection Agency data, the best type of data you could possibly get. We found it was almost barely 1/2 as much as the EIO data. So in this case, there is a 2 times error factor between the EIO data and the specific data. So clearly there can be a lot of uncertainty associated with this EIO data. This can lead to confusion in results, lead to your erroneous conclusions, and is the issue that can be a factor for problems with the credibility of the final results. Another issue with this type of spend EIO data is that it cannot allow you to track targets. So it's not possible to really set good targets for Scope 3 purchased goods and services if it's based entirely on spend intensity factors. This is simply because a change in price could make your goals difficult to achieve. If a supplier increases the cost of their good for whatever reason, or you shift to a more expensive supplier even though the underlying product doesn't change, this can actually sort of blow up your goals and make them impossible to achieve, even when nothing really happened besides a different amount of purchase. For these reasons, EIO databases are most effective as a screening approach or for applying to small contributors in the greenhouse gas inventory. As I sort of said, supplier or the secondary process data is strongly preferable, though in some situations, in many situations I should say, a mix of the two will most likely be required. Now just to recap and conclude before we get into questions and answers on some key steps on ensuring your Scope 3 purchased goods and services inventory is accurate. You want to make sure that you focus your efforts on collecting the data you need. Don't chase after diminishing returns. So you want to avoid chasing after suppliers that make up even cumulatively a very small contribution to the total inventory. And it's very important at the outset to understand the data sources you plan to use. And if you take these steps, you can really have a more accurate and credible Scope 3 inventory that can allow you to get the most business value out of the steps you're taking to evaluate it. Now, if you need help in managing your company's greenhouse gas emissions or evaluating Scope 3, you can work with SCS to do a greenhouse gas inventory, assist in target setting, policy development, and carbon neutral claims. You can also take steps to business value leveraging SCS as a marketing partner. And with that, I think we can go to Q&A, Holly.
Thanks, Tobias. We've had a couple of questions come in through the chat window, but feel free to send in your questions right now. The first question, you mentioned different LCI databases. How many are there, and what is the typical cost?
Useful. These LCI databases are very useful depending on the sort of application and depth of your greenhouse gas inventory. Purchasing these databases gives you access to a whole lot of great data, but at the same time it's a decision to be made carefully. If you have a very big and complex supply chain with many products, it can be an invaluable way to quickly and easily create greenhouse gas assessments. But if you're a small organization with a relatively small supply chain, it might not be worth the money to spend a lot on these databases. In terms of the cost, this can vary a lot. From the U.S. Lifecycle Inventory database, this is actually a freely available database. If you Google search that and U.S. LCI National Renewable Energy Laboratory, you'll be able to access that database quite easily. However, it's not as comprehensive as some of the commercially available ones, such as Inventories, which can take a few $1,000s to acquire a database license. So at SCS, we do many LCAs, life cycle assessments, and Scope 3 assessments regularly using all of these databases. So if you choose to work with us in doing an assessment, we can readily apply that data so you can have guaranteed access to the best data around. And if you're thinking of exploring purchasing of an LCA database for your organization, I'd encourage you to reach out to Holly for a consultation. we can have a more in-depth conversation about your needs and give a recommendation on what's kind of the best data source to go for, so you don't spend a bunch of money that's unnecessary on an LCA database which you might not fully utilize.
Great, thank you, Tobias. Another question we had that came in, do you have a suggestion on how you can use supplier CDP information?
Yeah, that's actually a trick that we've used in several Scope 3 purchase goods and services. So if you have a supplier that has publicly reported to CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and you're able to get that report because it's a public disclosure, you can take information straight out of that CDP report and apply it in your your own greenhouse gas inventory. That's kind of the intention of the CDP program. Now, the level and depth of quality that different companies and suppliers will report into CDP can vary a lot. So, for example, if you have a supplier just reporting Scope 1 and 2, it might not be as comprehensive and useful as one that's reporting all the way through Scope 1, 2, and 3. However, regardless, if your supplier is reporting something at all, that's better than nothing, and certainly is a shortcut to gathering supplier-specific data. And certainly before you do go out to collect supplier-specific data, you want to check that that company hasn't reported to CDP. It may have publicly available data already available through that platform. I'd also recommend what the approach we use in collecting that supplier data is, even if they're not reporting to CDP, often companies have public greenhouse gas inventories or in corporate sustainability reports where they do publish greenhouse gas emissions data. So there might be publicly available data already available for a supplier, which could shortcut you from having to gather data yourself.
Great, thanks, Tobias. Another question that came in, is it normal for suppliers to have credible information on their own supply chain data?
That's a good question. And the real simple answer is that unless your supplier itself has done a life cycle assessment or their own Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventory, the short answer really is no. Really, those are the cases where we found that you can have a supplier that really has the data packaged up and ready to go. Now, often what we found is suppliers, more often than you think, do have that type of information already available. You simply have to request it. They might even have a quite detailed LCA report that you can use. So the example of this global-sized apparel company that I mentioned, of the 5 suppliers that we surveyed, 2 or 3 actually had quite detailed LCA reports ready to go. They were confidential and hadn't been publicly shared. So once we got into dialogue with them about data, we learned that, and that was able to shortcut a whole lot of process about collecting data from different facilities and all the rest. So I think the short answer is, unless they've done those LCA or Scope 3 work themselves, suppliers won't have that information. But depending who you're working with, there might be a lot already available in that type of format.
Great, thank you, Tobias. Another question, we had a slide on sources of data such as LCA and EPDs. Does that follow a hierarchy? Is it possible to bring that slide up again? And does that follow a hierarchy?
Yes, it does. I'll go through that again. Give me just a second to pull up that slide. Okay. Is that displaying all right, Holly, for our audience?
Yes, I'm not sure if that's the slide they're referring to, but it's displaying fine.
Yeah, well, I'll speak to this hierarchy of data, and the hierarchy here is really certainly what we would recommend in terms of data. I think in terms of accuracy, kind of from the top to the bottom, is most accurate to least accurate. So the supplier-specific data is the most accurate. As you go down to the spend-based method, that's the least accurate. However, as I said, the supplier-specific across the supply chain is quite difficult. And really the sweet spot that we see that we almost always use is the hybrid method or the average data method. That's the preferred type of data that's the most accurate and yet still practical to obtain. So let me know if that's okay. Clarifying the question here. I think there's a slide on EPDs and LCA databases. Can you repeat that question, Holly?
Yes, the question is, she's looking for the slide about data sources. Yeah, I think it must be this slide that you have right now.
Okay.
Is there a hierarchy to these data sources?
Okay. Yeah, so the hierarchy, it's difficult to give a single simple answer to the hierarchy because based on the data sets you're modeling and the type of relevance to your greenhouse gas inventory, you may have situations where, for example, EcoInvent doesn't have a good data set, but US LCI does. A couple rules of thumb, though. EcoInvent generally is a much more accurate and comprehensive database than the US Lifecycle Inventory database. EcoInvent is kind of the gold standard. What is the gold standard for lifecycle assessment data in our view out there? The second one is the GABI database, which I didn't show on this slide. Those are two commercially available ones that are sort of the most comprehensive and accurate ones out there today. US LCI is a freely available one. It has a lot of data specific to the United States. However, it's much less comprehensive, and I'd also say much less transparent in its documentation. EcoInvent has a tremendous amount of documentation on data quality, which is another reason that it's very useful. So those are the databases in terms of environmental product declarations. So these can be useful, particularly if you have a specific supplier that has published one of these things in EPD, because that basically is published formal LCA results. So those are a great option if they sort of fit properly in the right place into your inventory. The main limitations of the environmental product declarations is that the result is not fully is not broken out usually in a lot of depth. Usually you can essentially have a single greenhouse gas inventory number for a specific set of products, and not a whole lot more depth, which may be all you need in a specific case. But I would say in a situation where you have a supplier-specific environmental product declaration, that's definitely what you want to use, or any type of specific LCA. If you do run into that case, so coming back to the hierarchy here, if they're available, I would say an EPD is probably most preferable over the other LCA databases. EcoInvent would certainly be preferable over US LCI generally, provided the data sets are in the right place. But it's important to review what data sets are available, any limitations there are, kind of how they fit with your data. There's a lot of kind of complexity that can go into that. And if you do have more specific detailed questions about this for your specific case, I definitely recommend reaching out to Holly about a consultation. This type of work SCS does all the time. We have a whole staff of life cycle assessment practitioners going through this. So we can help you in your specific instance identify the most favorable data source and recommend the best option for you in your situation.
Great, thank you, Tobias. Another question we had come in, how many Scope 3 categories need to be covered, and how are the categories determined?
Yes, so it's a great question, and the reality is there isn't a single answer. How many categories you include depends on how you want to use the greenhouse gas emissions assessment. If you're reporting to CDP, for example, and you're interested in getting a good CDP score, you get more points the more categories you include, particularly once you get into the Scope 3. So more categories is better in terms of CDP scoring. If you're interested in setting up holistic greenhouse gas reduction targets and having a really thorough, accurate, holistic greenhouse gas reduction plan for your company, it's also really important to consider all of these Scope 3 categories, since it's probably such a big part of your footprint. Kind of the rule of thumb is that the Scope 3 accounts for 80% or something like that of most companies' greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly, a really holistic greenhouse gas plan will include all of those buckets of Scope 3 categories.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tobias. One other question we had come in: how can you create a strong business case from the GHG results to ensure you transform a company's supply chain or create a climate action plan?
So that's a great question, and there's a few ways that evaluating the Scope 3 purchase goods and services can help you help support a business case and help you craft a really good climate action plan. For one thing, we always find that learning about the supply chain is also extremely informative to our clients. It just helps a lot of transparency in terms of what are the major spend categories, how they all fit into the big picture. So there's a learning component that's quite useful to understand more thoroughly and can be useful in other applications if you're evaluating things like environmental risk and these other factors. It's a good starting point for those types of other evaluations. You also may be able to identify different ways to reduce costs that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, in terms of things like reducing transport distances or identifying suppliers that have a really high energy use per product. We recently completed a screening evaluation for another large apparel company, where they wanted to use the Scope 3 inventory to identify the low-performing suppliers in terms of energy efficiency and seek ways to improve it. So clearly that's a key ask for companies. Another business case that can be made, depending on your industry. So for example, if you're in the agriculture industry or forestry, looking through your supply chain to start to map it out in order to begin to look at ways that risks from climate change impacts could begin to impact your suppliers. It's a good starting point to use this greenhouse gas inventory to map out your supply chain to begin to identify what types of climate change risks, threats, and opportunities may exist. So those are some of the concrete ones in terms of actually working within the supply chain. Other benefits that companies use is there's ways to foster employee engagement with this type of work. So I was recently gave a talk at a large biotech firm in the Bay Area, here where we're located, and they had a whole policy speaking about their greenhouse gas action plan, how they had a reduction target to 2020, how they had specific employees that were supposed to be champions for specific parts of the greenhouse gas plan. So it was a really good way to kind of market it internally to foster employee engagement and retention. So there's a approach for business case having to do with employee recruitment and retention. It's also, as I talked in more depth on the previous webinar last week, there's a lot of marketing benefits you can get from this type of Scope 3 work. So for example, if you do start to work within your supply chain, it can give you all kinds of good sustainability and stories and all sorts of things that can allow you to market proactively for the benefits of your own brand, and also things like helping to market and support sales for products with greenhouse gas attributes. So that was a laundry list of possibilities for the business case for evaluating the Scope 3 greenhouse gas inventory. I think if you're interested in diving into this deeper with us, I definitely suggest having a free consultation with us, because we can help work through all those options in more depth for you.
Great, thanks, Tobias. We have a few more questions. How can you calculate GHG emissions for upstream transportation in the supply chain?
Yeah, that is a good question, and the same sort of thinking applies as for the purchase goods and services, although it's not exactly the same data sources. Clearly, you want to have the most specific data you can, and preferably you also want to have data that is sort of tied to the actual vehicle miles. So what we've done for companies with simpler supply chains, for example, is simply map out the different facilities that the company operates, and then map out the suppliers providing materials to those different facilities, and then you can quite simply calculate the miles traveled. You know, even using a tool like Google Maps or something like that, that will give you the answer to within the accuracy you need. Because often you'll find, you know, a facility might be purchasing goods from overseas, so it might end up being, you know, thousands of miles of overseas transport and 100 miles or so of trucking, and even getting to within a rough estimate of that will be good enough, and there's a very practical way to do it. Now, if you have a more complex company with numbers of facilities and, you know, countless suppliers, as we saw with the one example I showed, hundreds of suppliers, generally you'll hopefully or probably be able to get the same type of at least a spend data output for the different distribution companies and company-owned vehicle operations you have across the entire company. Now, similarly, if you can translate any type of the spend to the miles traveled, that'll be the best way to do it. And that can require a bit more work to do that conversion. But there's essentially a few ways to slice that based on the type of data that you have, based on either the miles traveled, most preferably, or the spends. It's very simple to calculate greenhouse gas emissions once you have miles traveled for different vehicles. It's just a matter of getting that type of data.
Great, thank you. Another question we have, can you give an example of tracking results or progress using the hybrid model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking of a good example to speak about with this. Yeah, one client we worked with recently on the Scope 3 inventory, they had a hybrid model where they had supplier data for something like 10 or 20 of their the top 10 or 20 of their suppliers that they had gathered either from CDP reports or from actually engaging with the suppliers. They evaluated that over a few years, and then they had calculated the rest with spend data. And they were taking the first steps to try to map out targets based on the total emissions across the Scope 3. Now that was somewhat challenging because they had only the spend data, and so they were hesitant to put any hard targets into place. It's usually what we'll see with companies that do a Scope 3 purchase goods and services based purely on the spend or EIO data. They're very hesitant to set concrete targets because, as I sort of said, it's practically impossible to do so. Other companies we have worked with where we did have harder, more concrete data based entirely on, we worked with this food processor I mentioned, and we had specific data on the amount of ingredients per product, the number of products sold, and et cetera. So for that, they were able to set a lot more concrete targets about, well, what are our major buckets, how might we start to reduce this. I would say overall, setting targets for the Scope 3 purchase goods and services, that sort of will set you apart as a company. A lot of companies are just trying to learn how to do that because it is quite challenging for the reasons I've talked about today. It's kind of on the cutting edge of things, and it's a good way to set yourself ahead of your competition. So another good topic for a consultation, so we can talk about with you your specific kind of situation and what types of targets you might set and the data you'll need to get there.
Great, thanks, Tobias. Another question we had come in, where should I start if I've never assessed Scope 3 before?
Yeah, so I think that I'd suggest speaking with us, and we can talk about in more depth kind of what scopes you want to evaluate and all the rest. We have things like greenhouse gas calculator tools and fairly simple tools that are easy to use for many of the categories. A lot of the categories are fairly straightforward to calculate if you have relatively simple supply chain. That's just the data gathering that can be quite complex. So if you are trying to dive into the deep end for Scope 3, it gets very much more difficult very quickly, particularly looking at purchased goods and services for the reasons I've talked about here. So I think your first step is to figure out particularly which Scope 3 categories you want to include and begin to work through the steps I've talked about here in terms of setting up data collection plans, collecting data, evaluating inventories.
Great, thanks, Tobias. Another person asked, is this guidance also applicable to the capital goods category of Scope 3 emissions?
Oh, that's a great and a tough question. And actually, a lot of it is very directly applicable. Often companies will have capital goods data expressed exactly the same way in terms of spend. And in those cases, everything I've talked about here, gets quite directly in with that. So I would say the short answer is yes, everything I've spoken about here applies pretty much identically to the capital goods category.
Okay, great. Another question, is there a standard guidance for developing company GHG climate action plans?
There are some very high-level ISO standards, but nothing very detailed at this point. The first step, the only kind of ubiquitous step I would say, is the WRI greenhouse gas protocols for evaluating the inventory. But then there's kind of many other steps and approaches that can be taken for a company in terms of setting the next, setting the details down of a climate action plan. I would say generally, we've done market surveys to understand what people are actually doing, and the real steps are, I've spoken about on prior webinars, but it's worth talking about again in more depth. The first step is evaluating the greenhouse gas inventory. From that, setting greenhouse gas reduction targets, so things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions 10% by 2025 or something like that. Companies usually do it to 2020 or now 2030, now that 2020 is getting pretty close. Once you've set those greenhouse gas reduction targets, which will usually vary by greenhouse gas emission category, you can then begin to develop policies to achieve those reductions. So whether it's fuel switching in company-owned vehicles, I was speaking with a supplier, for example, of compressed natural gas that could perhaps have a greenhouse gas benefit compared to things like diesel or gasoline trucks, or having approaches for reducing employee commuting, or policies to engage with suppliers to reduce emissions. There's a whole set of policies that can be put into place to help achieve those targets. Once those policies have been put into place, the next step is, if interested, to pursue carbon neutrality for the company. Pretty much universally, well, I should say absolutely universally, given our economy is founded in a fossil fuel basis still today and will be for the foreseeable future, for a company to truly go carbon neutral, that involves purchasing of carbon offsets. We do have a lot of partners we work with, including the Arbor Day Foundation and Natural Capital Partners, who can help provide those types of carbon offsets to companies interested in pursuing carbon neutrality, whether it be for their company itself or for specific product lines, which is a type of approach we've seen emerging in the marketplace before. Then finally, once all these steps have been taken, report on the achievements, either in a corporate sustainability report or through CDP, or perhaps if it's going to be left internal, not report publicly at all and simply use it for internal engagement, reporting to employees or investors or what have you. The reporting approach depends very much on kind of your end needs and intentions for the climate action plan. So that was kind of a high-level walkthrough of how to set up that plan. Again, we're happy to talk about this in more depth in a consultation if you're interested.
Great, thanks, Tobias. We're getting pretty close to the hour here, but we had just one more quick question come in. kind of specifically related to upstream transportation emissions. If we aren't operating our own trucks or ships, but rather renting space, will the emission factors we use be per kilogram mile?
Yes, that's certainly the preferred type of emission factor and data point that you would want. That's they're very much the standard in life cycle assessment projects and that sort of thing, and that will usually always embed, you know, whether it's a one-way trip that goes empty on the way back or what that kind of fraction of freight capacity is utilized. That's definitely the preferable type of data point, kilograms per mile, and things like eco-invent, and I believe actually there's even public data from things like US EPA and that sort of thing that can provide that information. But that's certainly the preferred type of data that you want, kilograms per mile, to evaluate that upstream transportation for the transportation services that you are purchasing.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tobias. That's all the questions we have. Feel free to send us an email if you have another question. And also, as Tobias mentioned, we are offering a complimentary consultation for advising on GHG strategy. So please contact me if you're interested in setting up a consultation.